Welcome, everyone. We're just about to get started. It's wonderful to see you at the beginning of this, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the new school year. And we're really excited by the session we have today. So we're super excited with the session that we have today. Just as a reminder, for everyone, we'll have a Q&A part in the last half hour of the session today. So we'd love to welcome you just sharing comments and questions that you might have along the way. We'll be keeping track of those and we'll bring those questions back in at that last part so that Sharon and Mark and Dikila can take those on and explore together with all of us. Um, Today, we're really, really lucky to, of course, be in the wonderful hands of Sharon, and then welcome two wonderful guests, Dekila and Mark, who, together with Sharon, will be exploring the theme of interconnectedness. So, with that, Sharon, I think we should just get it over into your hands.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm really delighted to be here with two very good friends and the rest of you. I'm fascinated by just watching where you're all dialing in from, which is really everywhere. So I don't know whether to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening but good. May goodness be with you, whatever time zone you're in. And we're going to be talking about interconnection, which I find a fascinating topic. Um, Partly because I think the tendency we might all have is to feel quite isolated, at least at times, to feel very cut off and alone, and like we're going it alone, and everything is up to us. And whereas the truth is actually interconnection or interdependence. So then it becomes a question of perception. If that's actually how things are, we don't have to manufacture a situation to see that. We don't have to fabricate anything. We need to see more clearly and maybe a little bit more adventurously, not be stuck in the same old rut, and how we perceive our connection to one another, how we perceive our connection to nature, how we perceive our connection to life. So I think for just a few minutes, what I'd like to do is guide you in what is actually my very favorite reflection of all time. And it's very simple. Just as we are gathered here together, you can close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. See who comes to mind as someone who has played any role at all in your being here right now. Maybe they told you about this organization, they told you about their own explorations, they read you a poem, they challenged you in some way. Just see who comes to mind. When I do this reflection, I sometimes think of this government department in the state of New York, which gives out college scholarships to residents of New York State. And they gave me a scholarship many, many years ago, which is how I was able to go to college. And it was through a college program that I ended up going to India and learning how to meditate. So when I think, who's involved with my being here right now in some way, I think of them every time. And sometimes I do this reflection and I think about those really challenging times where I have felt like I was just at an edge, not a minor annoyance with somebody or an inconvenience. And those are the people who are also somehow a part of why I'm here right now. Because I did, in a way, rise to that challenge and say, I've got to look deeper. So many beings. Or if you've eaten food today, even if it wasn't a distinct animal product, somebody planted some soil and somebody harvested a crop and somebody transported that crop. Served it to us or sold it to us. so many beings. And so, as I said, this is my very favorite reflection because it is such a counter to that feeling of being alone, cut off. Every moment is like a confluence of all these relationships and influences and connections coming together. Every single moment in our lives. So because it's actually the truth of things, that truth of interconnection, it's got a kind of power. It's not just some idea we're trying to overlay on our actual experience. It's what happens when we see much more clearly. And that has a lot of consequences. In some ways, in our time right now, we so often see the more fearsome, even terrible face of interconnection. And there's also a great beauty in the truth of interconnection. And so that's what we're really going to explore together. So I will start by asking maybe first Mark and then Tequila, why does interconnection matter, do you think?
Thank you, Sharon, and hello, everybody. Lovely to be here on this call with you. Well, I think you said it so beautifully, Sharon, that we live in these times where, particularly having just still in living through a pandemic and sheltering in place a lot and intensifying that sense of being isolated and separate and disconnected, and that combined with the immensity of the challenges we're facing ecologically, socially, and otherwise. And it can be very overwhelming to feel like I'm alone, I'm separate, what does my life or my contribution matter? And we can feel so both alienated and overwhelmed and helpless when we feel that sense of separateness. And when we start to reflect, as you just did beautifully, on how we are connected from something as simple as the breath that we take. Like I was just listening to this wonderful scientist talk about, we're here because for 2 billion years, cyanobacteria, single-celled organisms, converted chemicals and sunlight into oxygen. And so we're related to those organisms 2.5 billion years ago who started bringing oxygen into the ocean. In the same way that when I think about forests and trees that I love so much because I spend a lot of my time outside, I'm literally breathing with trees. It's not just a nice idea, but we breathe because trees and plants and plankton exude oxygen. And so when I remember that, and actually feel that when I sit outside and breathe, it helps me feel less isolated, more connected. And because I feel more connected, then I feel more caring. So when I look outside my window, I live in Northern California, and I see the haze and the smoke from the forests that are providing us oxygen to breathe burning. It wakes me up to the fact that I'm both connected and have a responsibility to engage. So, and I think it helps us also get a sense of, because we're affected by these things in different but similar ways, particularly with the ecological crisis, there's a way that it can be a motivation for us to act, and realizing that we're not doing that alone. So I could go on, but that's preliminary thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you. Tequila, why do you think interconnection matters? And has it always, that notion or that idea always been connected for you with nature?
Mm-hmm. I just want to say everything Mark said before I start. Tashidila, everyone. So I think, from a very self-serving point of view, individualism hasn't gotten us to a very good place, has it? Right? We sort of, with individualism, what's happened is we've kind of inherited a worldview that's really what I think about as the Gospel of Scarcity, which is that it's me alone. I have to fight for what I have, and I need to accumulate as much as I can for me and mine, right? And when you look at where we are, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the health crisis, whether it's homelessness, whether it's COVID, that worldview has actually isolated us, whether it's at a national level or individual level or in our communities, and sort of created these schisms that don't benefit anyone. It just benefits a few people who control and set up systems that keep the rest of us apart. So I think going back to, even from a very self-serving point of view, thinking through what systems benefit us, for me personally, there are two lineages of knowledge gathering that I hold dearest. So one is the Dharma, right? I am a raised Tibetan Buddhist. I come from Sikkim in Northeast India. It's used to be a Himalayan kingdom that became one of the states of India and part of the great Tibetan Empire. And so I have this knowledge on interdependence that comes from that lineage. And then the other knowledge comes from science and comes from, my own field, which is environmental science. And for me, I'm always just so honestly blown away by what the commonalities between the Dharma and between natural science, right? This idea, for example, of ecosystem services, and how intricately connected everything is, and that you cannot remove one thing out of it, that we with our value systems might say, well, this is useless. And then lo and behold, it turns out 1/3 of our agriculture depends on the existence of bees, right? Or the water cycle, and just how, again, intricate and beautifully and interconnected they all are. And it requires these vast bodies as well as trees, and all of the different pieces that go into it. I think all singing the same chorus, which is we are interconnected. For me, what arises from interconnectedness then is, what does that mean for humans and the role we are playing on the planet? And I feel, being Himalayan Buddhist, and being raised the way I was. So I was raised very much in a lot of the wilderness areas in Sikkim. I come from the Bhutia tribe, and there are three tribal communities in Sikkim. And all of us have a worldview where nature is alive. We don't see nature as something that is dead or extant or, a resource, right? They all have their personalities, and they are as alive as we are. And so I know I said this before to Sharon in a conversation, we actually host the third tallest peak in the world, Kanchenjunga. But because he's alive to us and he is our protective deity, we don't allow him to be climbed. So no one outside of the Himalayas really knows he exists, right? And I think that interconnectedness piece to me is really valuable, because it also allows me to look at humanity and see where we are all connected. So what I see is this really strong kinship model in all Indigenous communities and knowledge systems, right? And how that is connected to the fact that Indigenous peoples are the first protectors of the earth, the greatest protectors of the earth, because they put their bodies on the line because nature is alive. I don't think I can pull any of these strands away. These are all part of what makes our worldviews. And I think we're at the point where most people are trying to find a worldview that's different than the one they inherited, right? Which is the dominant individualism worldview. So I'm just so grateful to be here in conversation. This is my favorite topic.
That's so great. Well, one of the ways I was, in addition to that kind of reflection that I led, that I was urged or invited to look at the world would just be like a slight perceptual shift that would bring in very much Tequila, as you described, as the aliveness, or Mark, as you described, as the kind of network of relationship that actually exists. And that was as simple as just look at a tree. And there's one way, one level you could say of seeing the tree. It's just standing there. It's just like this entity, this single thing there. And there's another way of looking at the tree, and sensing or even imagining the nature of the soil that is nourishing the tree and everything that affects the nature, the quality of that soil, like the rainfall, and everything that affects the quality of the rainfall, which we now know is pretty vast array, and the sunlight and the moonlight, and and so there's a way of looking at the tree, which is also true, where we see it not as a single, isolated, solid, seemingly solid, separate thing, but a network of relationship. That's what actually is making up the tree. And that, of course, is what is making us up as well. And so there's something about that that's like an alive system, rather than something static. And we still see the tree as a tree. It's like you want to climb a tree, you climb the tree, or build a tree house, you do that. It's a functional reality that's very important not to disregard, but it's not the only reality. And we miss so much, especially, let's say that tree has a problem and you want to try to address it. You've got to look at causes and conditions. You've got to look at that whole network. Is that right, Mark? Mark has been my nature guru for many, many years.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at the fires that are burning in the western states of North America, Canada, and beyond. And part of the reasons they're burning is because of global warming. The forests are stressed, which lowers their immune system, which allows the beetle bug to infiltrate, which basically we have millions of dead trees which are kindling. Combine that with higher temperatures and drier air, and we have this, the conditions for a less resilient forest. And so we're seeing that in so many different systems, that everything is intimately connected. And another example would be as we deplete the salmon populations and the salmon runs, which feed all kinds of species along the coast, and particularly the brown bear, and they realize the forest along the coast is becoming less resilient and healthy, partly because it was the poop from the grizzlies that eat the salmon and go into the forest and basically manure the forest. That's happening less, and so the forests are less healthy. I mean, it's intimately connected, and it's mysterious and miraculous and real.
Isn't it also true that some of the, like I keep reading that some of what we are seeking, the interest to resilience, for example, can be seen in, say, the ways of the forest, or the ways of nature, and that there's a lot to be learned just as human society about how do you renew or replenish after disruption, after a breakdown, after a tragedy even.
Absolutely. What I love about the term resilience is that it means the same things in different fields, which isn't always true for scientific terms, so it means the same thing in psychology or sociology or environmental science. It basically refers to the ability to bounce back, and the fact that we can bounce back from any kind of obstacle or crisis, and we can prepare ourselves so that that cushion is thicker and richer and stronger for us to survive, right? But what I also love about what it implies is that we may not go back to the way things were. And so for those of us who are here, who are really, have a practice, or are meditators, or, thinking, sort of more contemplative, let's say, I think it's a really good exercise because it allows us to let go of some of our attachment to how we want things to be, right? It's part of our practices have to allow us to decenter our own comfort, because things are changing and we are frightened because things are changing. So I think sort of refocusing on resilience allows us to do something that is positive, that benefits the community, allows us to be prepared for anything that is to come, right? But also allows us to be connected to what happens around us, because we actually cannot be resilient by ourselves. So I work a lot with faith leaders. I'm sure it's there in my bio. So I have a program that I do capacity building with different faith institutions and leaders and culture keepers of Indigenous traditions around environmental and climate change. So I've spent 12 years doing disaster preparedness with faith leaders. And what used to happen was that my way of dealing with my own anxiety around disasters, because we lived in California in a very disaster prone area for a long time, was I would build a bug out bag. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen a bug out bag, but it's basically the bag you grab if an earthquake hit, right? What is the thing where you have all your things put in it? And it's sort of the 101 of disaster preparedness. And so every time I'd come home from doing this training, I would sit with my bug out bag and do it. And it became this exercise of dealing with my own anxiety and dealing with developing resilience. And then lo and behold, an earthquake happened and I couldn't lift the bag. It turned out that I had built this bag that was so heavy, that was so filled literally with my attachments that it wasn't actually useful. And it was such a wake-up moment for me about what resilience means. Because actually resilience is what we hold in our minds and in our hearts and in our communities. And that's about it. So what a great practice, right? From a meditation point of view, but also from a very practical point of view.
It's fantastic. Oh my gosh. I don't even have a bag, but should I have a bag, I have to make sure I can lift it.
I'll send you a list.
So Mark, because you have been my nature guru for a very long time, a lot about me. And I grew up in New York City. I went to college in Buffalo, New York, which is also a large urban center. And then my first real life in nature, so to speak, was in India, where I could see, chicken walking down the street. And I think, oh, that's where it comes from. I didn't know. But in general, I often stay in cities and things like that. And there's something about nature also. It's not exactly defanged, I remember a meeting I was at many years ago, and a very influential environmentalist was there. And he said, I keep thinking it's different, like if you lie in the grass now, you have to think about Lyme disease. That's different than it used to be. And when you say we're breathing one another's air, that's not the most comforting thought either right now. So I wonder if you could say something about that side of things.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, nature is, it's everything, right? It's wild, it's beautiful, it's harsh, it's ruthless, it's impersonal in a certain way. The sea does not care that it takes your life if you happen to be swimming in the wrong place at the wrong time, nor does an apex predator. And it's true, we're living in different times. For example, I think Limes is a great example where, I grew up in England and would roll around grassy meadows and gardens and luxuriously, and now that's a rare privilege where you might find a place you can lie in the grass where you're not worried about limes. And of course, given globalization, Lyme disease and ticks and that prevalence has spread around the world. So I think what I appreciate about that, like when I'm walking up in the forest in the Northwest or up in the mountains where there's black bear and brown bear, who mostly, most animals don't want to have anything to do with us two-legged because we've wiped out 96% of wild animals. But they're still around. And I remember when I first came to the States from England and I was camping out in northern New Mexico at Vaisitos, where you and I both taught. And there's cougar and there's bear and there's coyote and bobcat and lynx. And I was like, ooh, we have ladybirds in England and we have swans. Like that's probably our most aggressive predator. And it was terrifying. But what I appreciated about it is it made me keenly sensitive to my place in the ecosystem, which wasn't in that situation the top predator. And it made me feel humble, but it also made me feel very aware, very connected, very respectful. and much more attuned to my environment, because I wasn't just walking through with the hubris of as we can do, of being unafraid because we think we're not part of the food chain. So I think I like that it increases my awareness and sensitivity, and everything has a place. I remember I was teaching at Spirit Rock, where you also teach, and I was going to my room, and I was walking along the trail, and there was a big piece of blade of grass hanging over the trail, and on the tip of the blade of grass was a tick doing its tick thing, which is waiting for a warm-blooded mammal to come along to grab onto to survive and feed its young and all of that. And I thought, oh, and I felt loving kindness for the tick. I didn't want the tick anywhere near me or on me, but just like, it's part of the ecosystem. I think when we talk about interconnectedness and the web of life, and as Dekila was pointing to, it also means opening to discomfort, opening to what we might consider inconvenience of ticks, and to realizing that it's a world that is complex, and we're just one part of it. And we've, because of the dominant sort of nature of how we've related to nature, we tend to think of that as a problem, rather than actually learning how to live sensitively within whatever ecosystem we're in. So I appreciate that, the wildness and the unsafety of it as an invitation to wake up to that's part of life, and it's real, and it can make us humble, which we've lost as often as a species. That the indigenous cultures have really are living with. We've lost that, with that wisdom and connection.
So I want to ask each of you about small ways we can build a practice of interconnectedness, maybe starting again with you, Mark. Like, what if you live in a city, by choice even? Let's say. Yeah.
So I think the important thing to remember is everything is nature. Everything is of the earth, however constructed and fabricated chemically and otherwise. Like I'm calling in from my house, and it was a forest. It's basically made of wood, and remembering that this is also of the earth. And when I step outside, however urban, I started meditation in East End of London, very urban area. But my practice was also around interconnection back then, and I was aware every time I left my house, nature was there. There's air, there's the atmosphere. Like when I move my hand, I'm changing the atmosphere. When I exhale, I'm changing the atmosphere literally, because I'm breathing more carbon into the air. And even in the city, when I lived in London particularly, I was aware of the seasons, the sunlight, a little bit of the moon cycle, and the wind and the elements and the rain. So that attuning to those elements that pervade everywhere, no matter how industrial or urban a place you live in, just that is helpful. And I think if you have the luxury of having anywhere to grow something, I think growing a plant, food. There's this wonderful friend she's an activist in Denver. And her way of staying connected is she has a small plot garden in downtown Denver, and she only plants native plant species, because if you plant native species of plants, it attracts the native insects, which attract the native birds, which attracts this whole sort of plethora of wildlife. Even in a little downtown, window box, you can create that sense of, oh, I am related to the broader systems of life, even in this city. So that's a couple of ways I like to think of that. Nature is everywhere, and we can see it in the seasons and the cycles. And
I wonder, Mark, if you have an actual practice of interconnectedness in daily life and daily urban life, perhaps, apart from the examples that you've said, and if you do, if you could lead us in one for maybe like 8 minutes or something.
Sure, happy to. Do we want to hear from Dekila about that same question first, or after?
Well, I was actually going to have you do the practice and then ask Dekila to take it away.
All right. Yeah. So we'll do a little contemplative practice, meditation practice. That's a way of connecting us to the elements, as a way of seeing how we're inextricably threaded and connected with life, which but I learned in the Buddhist tradition, but it's really common to many traditions. So if you'd like to just take a moment to, well, you're already sitting, so closing your eyes and just taking a moment to pause, letting the words of the conversation settle. And bringing awareness into your body. And just sensing your body sitting or whatever posture you're in. And feeling your physical form, this fleshy, skin-bound form we call body. Feeling the flesh, the muscles, the bones, the heaviness, the weight, density, the form, this living form. And we can feel like this form is quite separate from everything around us. But if we take a moment to reflect, how does this form come to be? The earth in us, the earth element in us, we take in through eating food, through eating plants, animals. So we come from the earth literally. And we sustain ourselves through eating the earth element from the soils, from plants. And that very earth element in the plants and the soil becomes our flesh, our muscles, our tissues, our bones. And when we die, that earth element in our bodies returns to the earth, becomes part of something else. So sensing this earth element, as it were, your body, that's no different from the earth element underneath you in the ground, the soil, the rocks, the stone. No different from the solidity of the buildings and the wood around you. No different from the trees and the plants around you. The earth element in our body, skin, flesh, bones, hardness. We feel it as hardness, as density, as weight. This is of the earth, from the earth. We are part of the earth's moving surface. Sensing yourself as earth. Not separate from all the other expressions of the earth element. And in the same way, another element we have within us that makes us possible is the water element. So we drink the water element through water and fluids, and that water becomes our blood, our tears, our sweat, saliva, fluidity in our joints, GI tract. And the water element within us, we're mostly water, not separate from the oceans and the evaporation into clouds and rain and snowfall, and the water in the lakes and the streams. We drink the water element, literally drinking rainwater, snowpack, the water held underground in aquifers and springs. We're literally becoming rainwater. We carry within us snowmelt. We are skin-bound ocean. And the water element outside and inside, not separate. And we can feel the water element within us as wetness, as fluidity, the wetness, the salinity of our tears, like the saline ocean, the movement of blood, the sweat on our skin, the moisture in our mouth. This is all the water element. When you live in a particular place, drinking from a particular well or aquifer, you're more that aquifer, more that snowmelt than anything else. And the same too as we breathe, sensing your breath. Each moment we breathe, we're taking in the air element. We can't survive more than a few minutes without this element. We breathe in oxygen released from forests, trees, grasslands, plants, plankton. Taking in that freely given oxygen, oxygenating our cells, our brain. And each exhale, we release carbon back into the atmosphere, reabsorbed by that same plant kingdom. Sensing how each breath we breathe the same air, we take the same breath. We breathe with all breathing life. We breathe with all forests, literally. And lastly, we can also sense the fire element, the warmth in our belly is not separate from the burning sun 84 million miles away. It brings life to this earth, brings light and warmth. The energy of that light transmuted into by plants that we absorb that energy as we eat. So sensing this swirl of elements within us, the earth element being of the earth, the water element being part of the hydrological cycle, the air element as we breathe with forests, fire element as we feel the connection with sunlight. All these elements inside, all these elements around us in every life form, same element. We're intimately connected with all life forms and with each other through these elements. And as you open your eyes and you bring this reflection to a close, just looking around, and you might see buildings and windows and screens and computers and stuff, and maybe outside maybe you see a tree or a plant or something, right? Oh, look, I'm surrounded by the earth element. This is not different or separate from me. And the space around us, the air element, oh right, the air element is what threads us like the ocean threads the marine population. So play with this reflection as you moving through your day and sensing, oh, what's inside and outside, not so separate, not so different. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. So, Dekila, I want to ask you also what you think are small ways we can build a practice of interconnection, and not only with nature per se, which we tend to think of as separate from us, but with one another, and especially, as we talk about sensitivity, as we talk about this kind of connection, and even interdependence has a flavor of vulnerability sometimes to it. It's like, how do we find a sense of agency within that? as well, to not feel kind of the sorrow only of things falling apart or changing so much in that direction.
I love how you put it, because I think it's worth stating, wherever we can, that we are part of nature, right? We, going back to the dualism we do and the sort of individualism we do, we really have a tendency to think of humans as being separate from nature. But we are one species among 200 million species, inhabiting this planet. And one of the things I love is the image of the Earth in space, sort of our marbled planet, because it always reminds me of the fact that the Earth is a closed system, right? We have the atmosphere, we have the hydrosphere, we have the geosphere, right? And that nothing actually naturally leaves or enters the planet. Well, besides a few billionaires, nothing really leaves it, and a few meteors, right? We, all of us, whether we like each other, hate each other's politics, look down on each other, whatever we're doing to the planet, it's all happening here in this closed system. And in a weird way, there is no escape, right? How frightening and how wonderful is that? So we are constantly recycling into one another. We are born, we live, and we die on this planet. And whatever material thing that makes us actually eventually degrades, dissolves, disappears, and becomes part of that system. And so whether we like it or not, on a really biological level, we are interconnected and recycling into one another. And I think that both can be frightening and reassuring, because it sort of reaffirms the fact that we are part of a greater whole. I think bringing up eco-anxiety in particular, or climate grief or environmental grief that so many of us are holding, it always helps me to remember why we are experiencing this. And, so I'm going to refer to Carl Jung, who took this idea actually from indigenous traditions. He plagiarized it. But, he came up with this idea of anima mundi, right? The greater soul. And this idea that we actually, whatever we imagine our identity to be, is part of this greater, inexpressible soul. And that the earth or the universe has its own soul and we're part of it. And the suffering we experience when we think about environmental degradation or whales sort of losing their way or whatever it might be, comes from this connection, doesn't it? From the fact that our identity is fluid enough. The self that we've crafted in our mind, right? It doesn't actually end with our body. It's actually been fluid enough that it's adopted something larger than us. So it could be a river we grew up fishing in with our parents. It could be an animal we saw as a child that just filled us with awe, right? It could be that blue planet that we saw in a science class and it never left us. But that our sense of identity was fluid enough that we absorbed that as part of our identity. So when that larger identity is harmed, it's very personal, right? It stings. And we don't understand why other people are not as upset as we are. That's part of the anxiety too, is it comes from this frustration that, our leaders are not doing enough, right? Our organizations are not doing enough. They're too distracted, because that pain is so personal. So I think there's something really reassuring to remind ourselves where it originates, that it originates from selflessness. It really originates from the fact that we have this capacity to love and adopt and, embrace an identity that is so much larger than our own. I mean, the challenge is, how do we do that with people that really disagree with us on the other side? But then again, that's part of the practice, isn't it?
So you're reminding me of something I've often quoted, where somebody had written that grief is love that doesn't have the ordinary place to land. The kind of surety or the confidence of that person being there, or that way of life being there, or that forest being there, is really love. And we don't necessarily think about that. We think about the loss or the fear, as you say, which is also very real. But underneath that, or maybe at the heart of that, is a quality of love, and we can honor that. You're also making me think of a question I have asked myself most markedly probably since the beginning of the pandemic, where so much of what I was expecting in terms of my routine, just shattered. It was gone. Which is like, what's still true? Like, is there something still whole or not so damaged by all of this unfolding in some way? And I think you address that really beautifully, because it is not easy to know what to do with the grief, for example, or the sorrow.
I think, one thing about the grief is, and the anxiety, is that we don't turn it into our enemy, right? That we understand, first of all, it's a really valid coping mechanism our minds have come up with while dealing with an existential crisis. It's valid what we're experiencing. And I think the other part of it, and for me, this comes from cheer practice, which is sort of cutting through all your attachments practice, is that what do you do with that grief, right? Do you cling to it? Does it become something else that then sort of, isolates us and we cling to and we kind of protect and take care of, right? And assume that it's greater than other people's grief, right? Or is it something that can become the source of action, community action, or is it something that can be an offering that actually provides healing for others? So for me, being Himalayan and being Tibetan Buddhist, I turn to my lineage. And so we have this practice, which is Sherab and Top, right? Which is wisdom. You can't have wisdom without method, and you cannot have a method, a practical application without the wisdom. So it's sort of, what do we do when we confront that grief? And when we have that moment where we're sitting and, let's say visualizing what that grief looks like, what do we do with it? Do we befriend it? Do we suppress it? Do we, it matters so much how we view it as part of our practice and what we take into our daily world with that, right? So that we apply it practically.
So do you, like when you're speaking to people who are maybe from a secular background or a different faith tradition, as you have been, doing that work, is that kind of the place where people meet? Is like, what do you do with all of that anxiety and all of that grief?
Yes, that's so interesting. I typically so I work, for example, with evangelical leaders, right? Which is very unexpected for a lot of people, that this Buddhist woman from the Himalayas partners with all these evangelical church leaders on climate and environmental action. It's interesting to me how there is a point of commonality for all of us. And that has to do with the people we most want to protect, or the community we most want to protect. For evangelicals, for example, they really have a sense of a global church. And so what happens to the global church is very personal. Going back to the anima mundi, that's part of their identity. And so when we talk about disasters, I think, and they feel that grief, I think the conversation for me always is, well, your church is so dispersed. How can you only think about the church without thinking about those countries and, the policies in there, and then all these other issues start coming in, right? I also work with culture keepers of Indigenous traditions. And there it's a very different issue, because for the reason why I said communities is because for them, very naturally, non-human relatives are part of their community, right? So species, many of them have origin stories where humans actually came and survived on the planet, on the earth, because an animal helped them, or an animal transformed to become a human. And so for them, how amazing is that origin story, where actually we start with this relationship of gratitude to our non-human brethren and sisters, right? If that's a word. I think grief is one place where all of us come together, because we as humans, that's kind of part of life, is the sorrow that we experience on a very individual level. But I think the second part to it is whatever we're grieving for, that in-group needs to expand. Going back to some of the examples Mark gave, for me, when I think about what nature teaches me, the most important principle of resilience, ecosystem resilience, is diversity, right? It really comes down to the fact that the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more plant species it has, the more animal species it has, the more likely it is to bounce back. The other principle that's really interesting is freedom of movement, right? The ability, so the more freedom of movement there is for species in an ecosystem, once again, the more likely they are to bounce back. And then finally, decentralization is kind of the organizing principle of nature, right? So these are all lessons that we can gather and I think put into practice when we think about our grief. When we're thinking about our grief and trying to address it, first of all, we're not alone. There is a community that's grieving, whether we're connected with them or not. Second of all, it's a diverse community. And we want to lean into the diversity. It strengthens us. It makes us more resilient. And I think finally, this idea of moving away from a pyramid kind of leadership model, right? The more decentralized we are, the more diverse our leadership is, the more likely we are to survive what is to come. So this happens in so many levels for me, whether it's from the environmental science or dharma or just practical community organizing, But I encourage everyone to think through that. How do we offer our grief?
Wow, thank you. And I'm going to ask you, Dekila, to lead a practice in a minute. But first, Mark, is there something you'd like to say about that topic? I've also learned a lot from you about this.
Yeah. Well, Tequila said so many beautiful and wise things, so I mostly ditto to everything she said. The phrase that runs through the work that I've been doing, my nature-based meditation work for 20 years, is the phrase, we protect what we love. And as we allow ourselves to grieve, as we allow ourselves to feel the impact of what's happening ecologically and otherwise, of course, as a sensitive human being, we will feel pain. We will feel grief, sadness, loss, rage, fear, anxiety, all natural and very necessary to feel, because if we don't feel, what happens is we go numb. And numbness is one of the greatest sources of inaction, and perhaps one of the greatest threats to the planet is we overwhelmed with the data and the immensity that we shut down, and then we just distract ourselves. So, but when we let ourselves feel, it's creating fluidity in the system and dynamism. And that then, once the grief it's all waves. When the waves move through, there's more clarity, there's purposefulness. Is that, okay, how do I do with that? What do I do with that? And I think, we both need to feel, we need to befriend. And out of that, I think, comes fellowship. We naturally, because we're connected, we think, who is caring about this, and who is doing something about this, and how can I be part of a system that's moving with people who share and feel the same way. So I think it's really key, and it's something that often we're scared of, and or told it's a weakness, or told it's a distraction. And actually, I think it's essential, both for our own inner resilience and well-being, but also to actually fuel. Because when we let ourselves fully feel it, we feel the depth of our love and care. And I think that's a great motivation to act.
Thank you. So Dekila, I'm wondering if you can lead us in a compassion practice for about, let's say, 10 minutes or so, 8 to 10 minutes.
Sounds good. Although I have a couple of caveats before I begin.
Sure, yeah, of course.
I am not a meditation teacher, everyone. Sharon is and Mark is, and please find a really good, legitimate meditation teacher. It's not me. And then the second is because I'm Karma Kagyu, I belong to the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. I will refer to my lineage with this practice. So we have a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called Tonglen, which some of you might be familiar with, which is sort of the translation would be giving and receiving, right? So it's a sort of give and take that happens in this practice. It's usually a practice that is used quite a bit to address grief, but also to address anger or hatred. So it's a practice of transformation. And it's a practice of, in many ways, coming to terms with your demons, you know, coming to terms with the things that you have the strongest sort of either affinity to or kind of antipathy to, right? Like you either hate it or you love it. A little bit about why I created this practice, or why this practice was given to me is, so I'm an environmentalist, and I began my career working for the World Wildlife Fund in Asia, in the Himalayas, in tiger landscapes, and then the mountains, and then I moved on to work in the Greater Mekong. And within a 5 to 8 year period in the early 2000s, I started having panic attacks because I was working in forests where you couldn't hear anything, right? So we would work in a forest, we would do monitoring, we would look at all these species and come back a year later and it would be silent. And the sorrow and the grief and the rage I was experiencing, no one actually told me this is a condition. The term eco-anxiety hadn't been created. That was created in 2007 by Susan Clayton, for those of you who are interested. And so, you know, kind of watching all my peers going through the same thing. We all had terrible maladaptations to the suffering that we were experiencing. And in many ways, we were sort of the people at the front lines, realizing what it meant, what climate change meant, or habitat destruction meant. And in that space, I had a meeting with His Holiness the Karmapa, where I was the head of the Karma Kagyu lineage. And I was able to say, this is what's happening, and I cannot sleep, and I'm so angry all the time. And so he adapted Tonglen and gave me this practice. And that's the only reason why I offer it, because I'm not a meditation teacher, but it eases the suffering of my community of environmental people and social workers and people who really are invested in alleviating the suffering of other living beings. So with all of that as my caveat, I'm going to invite you to sort of sit a little straight. Imagine there's a line that's just pulling you up, right, from the middle of your head. So right here, and it's just pulling you a little bit. And then as you kind of align that line that's running through your body, I want you to actually relax. So you're not upright and straight and uncomfortable. You're kind of relaxing into your body and remembering your body is your home, right? And you are at home on the planet as well. I think this is important, that we let ourselves settle with love. You're activating your awareness of just being in your body. You're embodying. How cool is that? Right? Embodying means to have a soul invest in an animate form. How cool is that? So that's where we are. We're settling into awareness. Now I want you to extend your awareness to the ground beneath you. Notice where your body touches the seat or the floor, and how through that layer you are connected to the earth. You are right now rooted to the earth, and she is literally holding you up right now. Now bring your awareness to your incoming breath. The air that's entering your nostrils, your mouth, filling up your belly. All of that oxygen that keeps you alive, coming from forests near and far, phytoplankton, algae, oceans, lakes, rivers, plants. Unconditionally offered to you by the earth. Unconditionally there for all living beings. And how just by breathing, the carbon dioxide you're exhaling is nourishing different plants and forests, right? This is interdependence. You're embodying it simply by existing, effortless. And so we can relax here, allow ourselves to just accept the earth's compassion for us. Limitless, unconditional compassion. We are all breathing in tandem, receiving life as we inhale and offering life as we exhale. All of us are transferring energy and nutrients, participating naturally as part of one vast ecosystem. We are part of this ecosystem. Some of you will experience gratitude right now, and some of you may feel grief or anger for all the environmental and climate losses that are taking place. Whatever arises, this is natural. It's an empathic response because you've opened up your heart and you're experiencing this interconnectedness with nature and with the earth. The suffering comes from compassion. It is justified. As you inhale, you're breathing in the earth's compassion. And as you exhale, you're now exhaling gratitude. You are part of nature. You belong here. Nature heals you just as you can heal nature. It's the most intimate relationship we have. That air that's in our mouth right now, in our nose right now. Trust this relationship. And think about all the other ways the earth provides for us. Everything we're wearing right now, the house that surrounds us, the food we ate, the water we drank, all of that energy the earth gives us to keep us alive. It's a raw force of resilience. And so we breathe in resilience, and now we breathe out compassion. And so this part, what I want you to do is think about a place or an animal that you love. It could be a river or a forest, an insect, a species, even that marble planet I talked about. And so from this place of gratitude and compassion, allow yourself to visualize it, to open your heart to it, and to want to heal it. So all of that gratitude we're feeling right now, we offer that in the form of tenderness and compassion to this space. Our motivation is to alleviate the suffering of this place or this animal or the planet. And so when we breathe in, we now breathe in that distress. And when we breathe out love and compassion and care. This may be hard for some of you, that distress, just imagining it and holding it. So if that happens, you can always just bring it back to your breathing and accepting the compassion of the earth. And we do Tonglen for as long as we feel comfortable. So if it becomes uncomfortable, it's okay to stop and just sit in awareness. Receive the earth's compassion, offer your gratitude in return. And when you are ready, we can reverse the flow. So now allow yourself to receive gratitude from the earth. And what you breathe out is compassion, right? So what we're breathing in is gratitude. The earth is grateful you're alive. With each breath, you can set an intention to help heal the earth, to protect nature, protect species, right? And so the earth is grateful you're alive, that you want to solve the problem, that you're not part of the problem, that you're here together in community to heal one another and ourselves. You are part of the richness on this planet. You are part of what makes it marvelous. You are part of nature. Tishichi.
Thank you so much. It was so beautiful. Thank you both. I feel like I always learn so much from each of you. So, and thank you for Aaron for bringing us all together. So I think it's time, Aaron, for questions.
Thanks, Sharon. And thank you for everyone that shared questions in the chat. There's still time for more to be put in, but we'll start with a question, which is, if we are interconnected and we cannot be resilient by ourselves, then how can our own inner work make any difference to us as individuals? And Sharon, maybe you're a good person for us to start with this one. And then also Mark and Dikila.
I wasn't expecting that. That's very new. Our inner work is, as far as I understand, from my own experience and from teaching so many through these years, is actually the foundation, because otherwise we're both unaware, perhaps, and somewhat blocked in terms of recognizing what we're feeling, and don't find. And I think both these meditations led us to a place of finding that sense of agency, of connection. If you're numb, you're not going to get there. If you start just feeling helpless, which would be easy to do, it would be easy to not have a sense of agency. We're just kind of crushed by circumstance. And this holds true whatever kind of suffering we're seeking to address in our work, in our lives, because it's not easy. And there are actually ways of being aware of what we are feeling, and also having perspective on what we're feeling, so that it's not just one side of things. We see the potential, we see the love, for example, as well as the grief. And that's what I think helps us keep a sense of agency, which is at the heart of resilience. Like, we're not stuck.
Dikila, Mark, would you guys like to chime in?
I mean, one thing I'd say is that I think going back to, earlier when I was talking about Sherap and Thup, so the wisdom and the method, right? Our inner practice is crucial for that wisdom piece. We cannot run away from that, the suffering that we hold cannot be skillfully used if you haven't reckoned with it, We cannot run away from it and then expect ourselves to have overcome sorrow and suffering and grief, right? And so I think that space that we give for the inner work is really crucial for that. The other part for the inner work that, really matters is obviously it builds our motivation to be better, to be kinder, to expand our in-group, that's all part of what we do in our practice, isn't it? And I don't think those are replaceable by practical action. I think they have to come together, the practical part and then the inner work, right? They have to match each other. And it's sort of, in Buddhism, everything is set up like that, isn't it? Like wisdom and compassion, compassion and impermanence, right? So I think those are two really irreplaceable aspects for the work we do, whether it's to alleviate suffering for our human communities or whether it is to alleviate suffering for nature and our non-human communities.
Yeah, and just to add very briefly, with the truth of our inherent interconnectedness, that also includes, by necessity, what's happening on our inner life and inner world, and so it's important not to overlook that just because we're connected, it matters equally, if not more importantly, that we're cultivating, working, and clarifying our own, whether it's our own grief, our own motivation, and if we're part of the Earth's immune system, and we need to make this particular form a healthy part of the immune system, which supports the overall immune system.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dakila. Thank you, Sharon. The second question, I think, builds on this first question in an interesting way. So the question is, I understand that there is a deeper, larger consciousness that nature has due to this complex interconnectedness. Is our individual consciousness and whatever it holds or brings up continuously contributing to this larger, deeper consciousness of nature?
Well, we're getting into deep philosophical realms. My answer to some of these deeper questions is, who knows? Who knows? I mean, clearly, I think when James Lovelock talked about the Gaia and created the Gaia hypothesis and understood the Earth as a living system, as a biosphere that had inherent intelligence, was able to create relative homeostasis and conditions supportive for life, it seems that there is tremendous intelligence. Whether you call that consciousness, I don't know. Some people do, and if we understand that we are inherently part of that living biosphere, then of course whatever intelligence, wisdom, consciousness we bring to that, we of course are intimately, however minutely, impacting the field. So of course there's a relationship, and as we know, it takes very few percentage of people, for example, to create quite large transformational societal change. And so I think that's a good example of how we can seem small and unimportant, and yet actually that can still create significant change in the broader field, whether that's Gaia or in systems and structures. But I'm still left with who knows.
I'm going to venture a little bit further with no proper evidence. I think so, yes, right? Because communication is the sort of the evidence, isn't it, of consciousness. And we know in nature that everything communicates. We know trees communicate. There's amazing studies done by people like Suzanne Smart that basically looked at how trees push nutrients to ailing trees in the same grove. So at some point, a mother tree knows that there are trees in that grove that are suffering, and maybe they've fallen sick. And so they begin this wave of pushing nutrients under the soil through mycelium, right? And so they push it out, and then the other trees pick up that the mother tree has done this, and then they add to it. And so they start pushing out all of these nutrients to the tree. That is communication, isn't it? Which really points to the fact that there is consciousness. And we know there, I mean, we know what connects the world together is really so mushrooms, right? Basically, all the fabric, that there is a fabric that connects all of these ecosystems. You know, all the algae, the sort of lichen, everything that I can think of that we humans that they're invisible to our eye. We find them too humble to pay attention to, don't we? But it's kind of like that's the connective tissue in our body. Whether our mind is telling us we're conscious or not, our body is communicating constantly inside, isn't it? You know, we're breathing effortlessly. It's really hard to stop breathing and just sit back and say, I'm not going to breathe right now. Your body overrides that, doesn't it? So there is a kind of collective consciousness that's happening that doesn't have a director necessarily. You know, there isn't someone necessarily sitting there and directing, but that intercellular network is communicating to keep everything alive and healthy. And I mean, first of all, how cool and amazing is that? And then second of all, it brings me back to the power of, the decentralization aspect of nature, right? That whether we want to or not, we are participating in community. Whether we feel isolated or not, we are part of this larger community.
So I think we have time, perhaps, for one last question. What part of understanding interconnectedness is connected to action and knowing how to give and or take? Mark, would you be up for taking this on?
Sure, I'll take a stab. Well, I had a moment of clarity that just disappeared. That's the interconnected or lack of connection of synapses. I think if we understand ourselves as inherently part of a living system, and with any living system, there's roles and functions, and there are times when we are engaged and active, and at times when we're nourishing. What I learned from Indigenous peoples in Costa Rica when I was there was, for example, the understanding is that between midnight and noon, the tree is absorbing nutrients. And from noon to midnight, there's a kind of a emitting and irradiating. And so the time to approach a tree is actually from midday to midnight, not when the tree is absorbing. And so it was a beautiful metaphor for me of that life is always giving and receiving, right? We can't just give because we burn out. And we can't just take because we become selfish, self-absorbed, and disconnected. And so I think where mindfulness and self-awareness practices help is we track that we are a limited resource that's connected, and to be mindful of when it's helpful to be nourishing with our practices, meditation or whatever sort of resilience building practices we have, and when it's optimal to give and serve and take action. And I think the more we're aware of that balance of giving and receiving, of acting and nourishing, the more resilient we will be for the long haul. And we all know, given the crises that we're in, that we need to be resilient for the long haul, because the crises, certainly ecologically, are going to get worse. And so if we don't learn how to nourish, then we're going to burn out too soon. And so I think it's important for the system that we nourish ourselves and each other and support each other to do that, as well as take action. And I imagine for this community, the nourishing self-care may be something that might need to be enhanced and developed, because my work with activists in general is, because of the love and the care, the emphasis goes on to acting, and often forgetting that our body and our soul and heart and relationships need nourishment.
Thank you, Mark. And Sharon, I think this brings us to your closing word today.
Well, first I would want to ask Dekila, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here and the questions. And certainly Mark and Dekila for a really beautiful evocation. It's not just hearing the words, but it's feeling the world that you are weaving as a world of possibility of connection and communication. So at one point I was looking over my computer. I'm in the country in Massachusetts for the moment, and I looked over my computer, and there's some really large trees outside, and I saw autumn leaves. I saw that the leaves are changing color for autumn, and my very first thought was, it's too soon. And then I thought, I think this has some connection in a funny way to Dekila's example of the bag that's too heavy, which I can't draw out exactly, but it popped into my mind just having some connection. And I thought, look at that. What, that protestation, like it shouldn't be the way it is not that helpful, and how about starting with receiving how it is and paying attention to that and building on that for action, instead of thinking I better chop down those trees because they're reminding me of the unfortunate truth of change and seasons. It's like saying, all right, here we are. Now what? How is this going to inform me? How is this going to help me? Because I think seeing a deeper level of truth is always a good thing, and leads into every kind of change in our lives.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Dekila. Thank you, Mark, for what you shared with us in today's session. Just a little bit of a heads up for next month's session. So next month, we will be exploring together embodying diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to be joined by Justin Michael Williams. We're really, really excited about this session. Parker and Sharon have both been excited about putting this together. And so we're looking forward to seeing you all together again. In the meantime, thank you all. And what I'd love to ask, just as a final way of closing out, is if you could turn on your videos and actually just as a way of signing off, just to say goodbye, thank you and goodbye as you sign out so that we can hear your voices as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. It was great being here.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Well.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank
you, everyone.
See you next time.
Grateful to you.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.